The cowboy didn't believe in love until her whisper of thank you made him hold her forever. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Montana Territory, winter of 1882. The wind howled down from the snow-covered mountains, carrying a chill sharp as the cry of wolves across the desert night. Above the horizon, the sky burned red, with the last fire of sunset glowing like a bed of dying coals stretched to the ends of the earth. Boon Lark rode slow along a narrow trail, his horse's breath a cloud of frost in the air. His calloused hand was still stained with blood. His eyes, dark as frozen stone, gave nothing away. Each clink of his spurs struck the frozen ground, echoing like boots on the saloon's wooden floorboards. He meant to ride on, straight ahead, without looking back, just as he always had. Boone lived that way, never tethered to a soul. But then, through the screaming wind and the dead silence of snow, came a sound. A baby's cry, thin, trembling, fragile as a blade of glass. It cut straight through the hardened chest of a man who no longer believed his heart could feel. His hand slid to the butt of his gun out of pure instinct. And yet, in that one small moment, the cowboy who had refused love, who had buried mercy deep beneath years of loss, found himself stopping, listening. Because there, in the wild, cold life itself, was calling him to turn back. Montana Territory, late 19th century. A town slept under the mountains, its wooden houses weathered and leaning into the desert wind. Boards creaked, old signs broke loose, and dust clung to every forgotten corner. The saloon's lamps still flickered weakly. Doors banged in the wind. Down the abandoned rail line, rusted iron glimmered like a scar no time could heal. Boon Lark stepped down from the saddle. His boots were coated in dust spurs, striking hollow against the boards beneath his feet. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed half his face, but it could not hide the dark look in his eyes of a man who had seen too much loss to believe in anything called love. He was 40 now. He lived by hunting, trapping, and odd work at the horse stations. Folks said Boone was so quiet the town sometimes forgot he was even there. But that silence was its own confession. For years he had locked himself away from every trace of human warmth. His hand had clutched a gun in more standoffs than he could count, but it had never held another hand, never clung to someone to keep them close. For Boone, love was nothing but a saloon story, a drunken tale to chase off the loneliness of men with nothing left. And listening, you understand, Boone wasn't just avoiding the world outside. He was living in a prison of his own, making a prison built inside his chest, where the ashes of his heart smoldered quietly unseen. If you were the cowboy riding into this town, what would be the first thing you'd do? Part 1. The Fateful Encounter. The wind tore through the mountain pass, howling like wolves on the hunt. On the snow-covered trail, the hooves of an old gelding struck hard and hollow, echoing through the still pines. Boon Lark tugged his hat, lower breath, rising white around his thick beard. Blood seeped through the rough bandage on his arm, staining the worn coat he wore. He didn't slow down. Boone never slowed. His whole life had been built on leaving things behind. Bar fights, broken trails, even the kind of eyes that begged him to stay. But then cutting through the silence came another sound. Thin, high, trembling, a child's cry. Boone pulled hard on the reins. His horse snorted, stamping at the brittle ice. Inside his chest, a single heartbeat faltered. That cry wasn't just a call for help. It was the first crack in the thick wall of ice around his heart. He listened again. The sound grew clearer. Broken sobs carried on the wind from a bend in the trail. Boone muttered a low curse, swung down from the saddle. His rough palm brushed the crib of his colt. Out here, any strange sound could mean trouble. Bandits, wild beasts, or worse yet, the desperate. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved carefully forward, eyes scanning the trees. Then he saw it, an overturned wagon split apart on the slope, half buried beneath fresh snow. And beside it, a woman on her knees, arms locked tight around two children. A boy, maybe 9, his face streaked with dirt, eyes sharp as a wolf cub guarding its den. Beneath a torn blanket, a little girl of 6 or 7 shivered cheeks raw. Her voice cracked from too much crying. The woman lifted her head. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks smeared with earth, her skin pale with cold. But her eyes, wide, fierce, desperate, met Boone's, and in them he saw something that jolted him to a standstill, a wound that mirrored one of his own. Her voice broke rough and raw. They left us. Just 3 words, but they struck like a hammer in the silence. Boone blinked. His hand loosened on the gun. For the first time in years, in the roar of the wind, he heard something stir inside his chest, something he thought long dead. The woman's arms tightened around her children. Who are you?" she asked hoarse, as if Boone himself might be another threat. He dropped his hand from the colt, spoke low and steady. "Just passing through. Name's Boon Lark." The boy lifted his chin, eyes hard, clutching a ragged bundle as if it were a shield. The little girl, Lisa, pressed her face into her mother's chest, her cries dwindling to hiccups. Boone's gaze swept the wreckage, the snow, the empty trail. No fresh tracks, no sign of others. They'd been left alone in the dead of winter. "How long?" he asked, voice clipped. 3 days, the woman whispered. "We were with a freight train. The driver said my husband would meet us at Great Falls. But when I begged to wait, he rode on. Left us here." Boone's jaw tightened. "Left you, in this cold." She nodded lips, blue eyes lowered. "I begged. He said it wasn't his concern." The wind rose, stinging their faces with snow. Boone turned away, teeth clenched. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in the frontier, but some things still cut deep. He crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes. "Your name?" The boy hesitated. "Lyall," and her Boone nodded toward the girl. The mother's hand smoothed the blanket, her voice a whisper. "Lisa." Boone straightened, his gaze held on the woman. "And you, Celia Orwood." The name fell like an old scar spoken aloud. For a long moment, there was only the wind. Then Boone's voice came low, steady as a verdict. "Wagon's done. Town's too far. Stay here and you won't last the week." Celia's eyes widened, lips parting as if to argue, but Boone pressed on. "My cabin's not far. There's fire. Food. Not much, but enough." Her eyes flashed with doubt. She'd already been abandoned once. Why trust another stranger? Boone met her stare, his voice hard as stone. "Believe me or don't, but stay here and you'll die." Lyall looked from his mother to Boone, then gave a single sharp nod, too firm for his years. Celia's breath trembled. She looked at her children, then back to Boone, and with a voice shaking yet resolute, she said, "All right." Boone brought the gelding forward, lifting little Lisa gently onto the saddle. Her tiny hands clung to the reins. "Hold tight," he said. Lyle bristled standing guard, but Boone only nodded and swung him up behind. The horse shifted but held steady. Boone offered his rough hand to Celia. "Walk beside me. Cabin's not far." And so they went. Snow thickened, falling heavy like cold ash from the sky. Celia stumbled off and her shoes worn thin, but she never complained. Boone rode ahead, a broad figure cutting through the storm, the only shield between them and death. At last, smoke rose through the trees. Boone pointed. There, through the falling snow, a cabin appeared tucked beneath weighted pines, its chimney spilling a thin ribbon of gray. Celia's eyes blurred, but for the first time in 3 days, not from fear, this time from hope. Inside, warmth spilled out with the groan of the door. Firelight danced across the walls. A pot of stew bubbled softly on the stove venison, and potatoes filling the air with fragrance. Boone said nothing. He simply ladled bowls first for Lisa, then Lyle, then Celia. The children ate noisily, clumsy with hunger, their gratitude loud in every swallow. Celia's hands shook as she lifted her spoon. Tears streaked her face, silent testimony to hunger, cold, and despair. And then a whisper. Lisa looked up at Boone, her small voice fragile but clear. "Thank you." 2 words, thin as breath. Yet they pierced Boone deeper than any bullet ever had. His hand froze mid-motion. For a man who'd never believed in love, who'd never held on to anything but his gun, the sound was almost unbearable. He swallowed hard, gave the faintest nod. "Eat," he murmured. Celia's eyes flickered. Not trust yet. Not safety. But for the first time a spark, small but real, lit within them. That night, as snow hammered the windows and the wind wailed outside the cabin, filled with softer sounds, the sighs of children, the weariness of a woman finally at rest, Boone lay on the hard floor, back against the door eyes on the fire. But his gaze drifted again and again to the 3 figures huddled on his bed. And something strange ached in him. Not loneliness this time, but its opposite. The thought of a home. Part 2. The cabin lit by fire. Morning came and the mountains still lay buried in snow. Yet inside the small cabin, the air had changed. The fire burned steady in the stove, smoke curling through the chimney like a thin ribbon. On the hearth, the pot of stew from the night before still held a little venison and potatoes, rich and warm, pushing back against the winter outside. Boone rose early, as he always had. He split more firewood with a clean swing of his axe, stacking it neat by the door. When he stepped inside, Celia was still curled with her children beneath a quilt, leaning against the bed, half asleep with exhaustion. The pale morning light brushed her face, tracing the lines of hardship, but also the rare strength that had carried her this far. Boone said nothing. He only moved to the stove, stirring the pot in silence. The sound of the wooden spoon tapping the iron rang steady, like the heartbeat of the house. He ladled a bowl, set it before Lyle. "Eat. Warm you up." The boy hesitated, then quietly passed the bowl to his sister. Lisa sipped the broth in small gulps, her round eyes glowing with each swallow. When the heat slid down her throat, she looked up, lips trembling. "Thank you." The words, thin as a thread of smoke, cut straight through Boone. His hand froze on the ladle, his rough fingers tightening. In all his years, hunters, teamsters, barkeeps, no one had ever spoken those words to him. 2 simple syllables, and yet They nearly undid him. Celia's eyes brimmed watching her daughter. Then she lifted her gaze to Boon. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes held a second thank you, one deeper, heavier, pressing against the iron shell he had worn for so long. Boon gave a curt nod, voice low and rough. Eat. Plenty to do today. And in that moment, the cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It became something else, a bridge between a hardened man and 3 fragile lives joined together by the simplest of things, a hot meal. By midday, pale sunlight slipped through the small window, laying faint gold across the rough-hewn table. Boon sat at the head chewing a dry crust of bread in silence. Celia broke her piece, smaller, feeding Lisa first. Lyle sat upright, his sharp eyes locked on Boon, wary, as if afraid the man might steal away the fragile piece they had found. Boon felt the boy's stare, but wasn't troubled. He knew suspicion well. He had lived under it most of his life. He only glanced now and then toward Celia. She avoided his eyes, yet every move, tearing bread, steadying a spoon, bore a quiet devotion that silenced him. After a long while, Boon spoke, his voice like gravel. No one's coming. Too far. Folks who leave, don't come back. Celia froze, spoon in hand. Her eyes glazed, but she did not argue. She only nodded, soft but certain. I know, she whispered. Lyle's fists clenched on the table. I'll protect Ma. And Lisa too. Boon's gaze sharpened. The boy was thin, frail even, but in his eyes burned the same raw fire Boon had seen in men weathered by loss. A look that should never rest in a child. You will, Boon said simply, no mockery in his tone. Lyle blinked, startled by the recognition, then nodded as if the words had given him the first measure of a man's respect. Celia's lips trembled. She turned away. We don't want to trouble you. Boon braced his hand on the table, his voice flat. Trouble leaving 3 bodies out there in the snow, that would be trouble. The bluntness carried no softness, but it carried truth. Celia gripped her son's hand, holding back tears. Boon looked away, hiding the tightness in his chest against the wall of the cabin. That day, an unspoken vow settled between them. Their lives were bound now, though none dared put it into words. By late afternoon, the sun slid low, casting copper light across the cabin. Boon split wood, out front, the axe thudding into the block. Inside, Celia moved about the small kitchen. The place held little, a rough table, crooked chairs, blackened pots. Yet under her hands, it began to change. She folded the blankets neat, propped a log as a pillow for Lisa, wiped years of dust from the shelves with a damp cloth. A faint hum rose in her throat, not quite a song, but close. Boon heard it. His axe stilled mid-swing. It had been years since any voice sang inside this place. He stepped back in, leaning against the doorframe. Firelight washed over her face as she bent over the pot, a streak of soot smudged across her cheek. Her hair fell loose, shimmering with the glow. Boon felt a strange pressure in his chest, as though some long-buried ice had begun to crack. Lyle came in carrying sticks. Boon reached for them, but Celia moved quicker, taking them first. For a second, Boon's calloused hand brushed hers. The touch was slight, no more than ash in the air. Yet Celia flinched, her eyes flickering. They both paused, silent. The fire snapped, filling the space. Boon cleared his throat, pulling back. I'll take it. Celia only nodded, stacking the wood. But in her eyes lingered something, not fear, but a recognition. A quiet truth beneath his roughness. This man's actions carried a kindness he himself would never claim. That night, The cabin's fire burned brighter, not from the wood, but from the presence of a woman's hand. Boone sat back in his chair, watching Celia feed her children, wipe Lisa's mouth, tuck Lyle's blanket. And he knew. His cabin was no longer the same. The next morning, Boone strapped on his gun belt, saddled his mule. Celia stepped onto the porch, worry in her eyes. "Where are you going?" Wagon Boone answered simply. "I'll bring back what's left." She froze. She hadn't expected a stranger to care about scraps of her broken life, a few blankets, a wooden chest, a pair of worn shoes. But Boone's look gave no room for question. He pulled the reins and rode into the snow. Hours passed. Celia stood by the window, heart clawed with fear. Out here, one misstep could mean never returning. But as the day waned, hoofbeats rang out. Boone reappeared, shoulders heavy, with bundles strapped tight, blankets, a battered chest, a handful of books, a pair of small shoes worn thin. He dropped them at the porch, sweat and frost mingling on his coat. That's all there was. Celia's hands shook as she touched the chest. Each item carried memory loss and hope all at once. She lifted her eyes to Boone. For a heartbeat, there was no distance between them. Her hand brushed his sleeve, trembling. "You didn't have to." Boone shifted, but didn't pull away. "I know, but I did." The silence that followed was heavy, not with cold, but with words neither could say. Celia stepped back, nodding faintly. Yet something inside her had shifted, and Boone felt it too, though he turned quickly away, hiding behind his mule. That evening, Lyle smiled for the first time, clutching the old book Boone had brought back. Lisa hugged the worn shoes as though they were treasure. Celia cooked, glancing often at Boone. And for the first time, he didn't look away. Night fell, clear stars spilling across the black sky. The cabin stood quiet beneath the pines, smoke drifting steady into the stillness. Inside, the children slept, breathing soft, clutching their reclaimed treasures. Celia drew their blankets close, then stepped quietly outside. Boone was already there, leaning against the porch beam, eyes lost in the mountains. The faint scent of tobacco mingled with pine smoke. Moonlight washed his weathered face, carving deep the lines of solitude. Celia hesitated, then moved beside him. They stood in silence, the wind tugging loose strands of her hair. Boone spoke at last, his voice rough but softer than she had ever heard. "Tomorrow will be warmer. Snow's starting to break." She lowered her eyes, heart twisting. For years, no one had ever returned for her. No one had given her reason to hope. And yet this man, hard, gruff, untouchable, had done it all without asking for anything. Her voice broke barely above the whisper of wind. "Boone." He turned slightly, waiting. Celia leaned gently against him, her hair brushing his chest. Her breath trembled, her eyes closing as she released two fragile words. "Thank you." Just that. But for Boone, it was as if a gunshot had shattered the iron wall inside him. His chest tightened, his heart pounding with heat he had long denied. Without thought, his rough hand rose, settling on her shoulder, then drawing her close enough that the thin woman, worn yet unbroken, fit into the strength of his arms. He lowered his head, saying nothing, only breathing in the proof of life held against him. Above them, the stars bore witness, and in that quiet night, a cowboy who had sworn love was a lie felt the unspoken truth of it beating in his chest. Part 3. The first night together. Night fell slow, like ash drifting down. The fire in the hearth had quieted, leaving only glowing embers snapping softly, whispering like old wood, remembering its youth. Boone spread his heavy blanket by the door, where every draft of cold must pass through him first. His dust-worn boots stood upright at his head, his wide hat tipped low over the Colt at his hip, a soldier's order in the life of a man who had lived too long on guard. On the bed, Celia lay curled on her sidearms, wrapped tight around little Lisa. The girl nestled close, breathing as light as bird wings. On the floor by the fire, Lyle slept, clutching the book Boone had brought back, as though its pages were a charm against the hungry dreams of winter. Boone propped himself on an elbow. From his corner, he saw the weary slope of Celia's shoulder, the stray strands of her hair caught in the pillow, the even rhythm of two children breathing beside her. Such ordinary sounds, yet strange to him. Music the cabin had not heard in many years. He pulled the blanket to his chest, head turned, listening as a hunter listens to the forest. But it was not danger he heard. It was warmth. It was life. It was something he had once sworn never again to let near. Rising quietly, Boone added a log to the fire. Sparks leapt, painting brief stars across the wall before fading. The light brushed the scar along his arm, a relic from saloon brawls and nights with nothing but a saddle for a pillow. He gave a soundless chuckle. What endures longer in this world than loneliness? Lisa stirred. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders. Boone froze. One beat, two. Then rose in silence, padding forward in wool socks. He laid his own coat gently over the child. Celia did not wake, only tightened her arms around her daughter by instinct. Boone lingered a moment close enough to smell the faint soap in her hair, then stepped back, a shadow standing watch. He returned to his post. Wind scraped through the cracks, pressing cold against his back. Boone tugged the hat low over his eyes, cheek resting on the grip of his Colt. But across the room, the sound of 3 steady breaths rose and fell like a single heartbeat, the rhythm of a home. In that dark, Boone knew tonight he was not alone. And because of that, he felt the hollow inside himself more keenly than ever, the emptiness that had followed him for years. It whispered now, like saddle leather creaking in the night. Are you still cold enough to stand outside of this? Past midnight, the storm eased. Only snow dripping from the roof broke the silence. Boone shot upright at the softest whimper. Lisa stirred in a dream, her little hand groping for her mother. Celia murmured, pulling the girl close, a lullaby too faint to catch. Boone knelt by the hearth, pulled a cloth from his pocket, an old handkerchief once used to wipe down his Colt. He set about oiling the revolver motion slow and practiced the scent of gunmetal and oil rising like an old friend. It was ritual, discipline, the one tether that kept him from unraveling. But then the firelight touched another scar, not his, but the pale line across Celia's hand, where it rested on the blanket. He saw not just the mark of labor, hauling, mending, carrying, but all the unseen scars, hunger, cold, abandonment. Something inside him split another seam. Boone set the Colt aside. He lifted the thick coat he had been using as a blanket and stepped to the bed. Without a word, he draped it over mother and daughter. Celia stirred, eyes flickering open. Their gazes met in the wavering glow. No questions, no spoken thanks, only a faint nod and the warmth of her breath on his hand. He slipped outside. The night was glass clear. Stars shattered across the sky like 1,000 campfires. His horse pricked its ears, blowing white steam, a soft wicker of recognition. Somewhere far down the valley, a saloon door might still be swinging a train whistle, rusting into silence. Boone had passed through so many doors, entered, drank, left, never leaving a mark. "No one's asking you to stay," he muttered to himself. But when he stepped back inside, the moonlight on the floor had shifted. A thin beam stretched across the boards from his blanket to the edge of their bed. A bridge of light between two worlds. Boone lay down again. His hand dropped automatically to the Colt, but his heart no longer beat the same. The wall inside him, the one that had guarded him all these years, was cracking. On the other side, he heard 3 breaths blending into one, naming something he dared not say home. The wind changed, moaning through the pines like a distant train whistle. Memory struck him hard. The crash of iron, the shouts, the smoke. His brother, only 2 years older, left broken beneath a rail car. They had said it was quick, no time for pain. But Boone knew. The real pain was in what remained, the empty space that never closed. Since that day, he had built a fortress of silence. People came and went. None were allowed to stay. Faces blurred into smoke gone by morning. Survival meant solitude. Yet tonight, 3 breaths by a fire threatened to undo it all. Lyle's soft snore, Lisa's uneven sigh, Celia's weary turning, all weaving into a song so gentle it pierced. Boone's chest ached. He thought of his brother's eyes, warm, steady, trusting. Eyes he had sworn never again to face for fear of watching that light extinguish. But when Boone glanced at Celia, thin frame hair undone, arms folded around her children, he felt that gaze return silent, unasked, yet undeniable. He squeezed his eyes shut, exhaling rough. But the wind still keened, and Boone knew he was standing at the border. One side the fortress of solitude, the other the fragile warmth of a home he had never dared to claim. Near dawn, Boone reached for more wood, but his hand froze. Celia was already there. She had risen quietly, shawl around her shoulders, her face shadowed in ember light. She knelt, feeding the fire. When the flame leapt, she caught Boone's eyes. For a breath, both stilled. Boone began to draw back, but Celia laid her hand lightly on his. Just a touch, enough to send his heart thundering. Her fingers were warm, so unlike the cold he kept locked inside. He wanted to pull away, but couldn't. "You can't sleep either," she whispered. Her gaze stayed on the fire. Boone swallowed, nodded once. "Me neither," she said softly. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear that wheel breaking. I'm afraid I'll wake to find the children gone, like everything else I ever had." Boone studied her in profile, the fire sketching lines of weariness and strength. Words swelled in his chest. "You're safe now. No one will leave you again." But his throat closed. All that escaped was a low murmur. "Rest. I'll keep watch." Celia turned. Their eyes met. Her hand trembled on his, but did not withdraw. For a long moment, Boone sat frozen, trapped by the very closeness he had always feared. Then she nodded, faintly released him, and returned to bed. Boone remained hands still, burning from her touch. He dragged his hat low, trying to smother the tremor running his spine. But he knew the wall had cracked again. By the time dawn crept in, the storm was gone. The last ember glowed weakly, casting red veins across the wood. Boone stirred stiff from the floor. Outside, the horse stamped reassuring in its quiet rhythm. Celia no longer tossed in restless sleep. One arm draped over Lisa, the other hanging limp, her fingers chilled. Lyle clutched the book, brow furrowed, as though guarding in his dreams. Boone rose, pulled the blanket higher for Lisa, then gently covered Celia's hand with his own, warming it until her skin eased. He withdrew slowly, like retreating from a cliff he dared not look down. He poured the last of the coffee from the pot. It was cold, bitter, but familiar. Being the watchman meant little rest, only open eyes and a hardened heart. Yet tonight, his heart had not been hard. Somewhere in it, a coal had been placed, glowing against his will. Through the window, dawn leaked pale and milky, crawling across the floorboards, bridging his blanket to the bed where 3 steady breaths still lingered. A bridge of light. Boone stared at it chest tight, with something he had no name for the longing to stay. His hand drifted to the Colt. Cold steel, the thing that had always kept him alive. But he let it go, fingers open against the floor, open toward the beam of light. At the far end, Lisa's small hand slipped from the blanket close enough to reach, yet still apart. The distance of one palm, the distance of a lifetime. Boone looked long at it, longer than he'd ever allowed himself. And then so softly, he wasn't sure if it was thought or whisper he breathed. Stay. Not a command. A plea. To the fire. To the light. To the breathing in the quiet room. Outside, ice dripped from the roof. A lone bird called stubborn against the cold. Boone tipped his hat low, but this time, not to hide, he sat straight at the door, a sentinel not only against the storm outside, but against his own habit of leaving. When the first sun spilled over the ridge, the light touched his hand warm. Boone knew with aching clarity the fortress he had lived in so long was broken, and through its cracks, light was finding its way in. Part 4. Return to the past. Morning broke dim, the trail swallowed in deep snow. A pale sun struggled through gray clouds, spilling light across the crooked path that wound through the pines. Boone tightened the reins on the old mule, his scarred hand gripping firm, eyes fixed on the forest where the broken wagon lay. From the porch, Celia stood wrapped in her tattered wool shawl. You're leaving." Her voice was hoarse, almost swallowed by the silence. Boone did not look back. "Your things are still out there. Might be useful." But the road had slicked the snow. He cut her short voice, flat certain. "I know the way." And without another word, he spurred the mule forward. Hoofbeats faded into the wind, leaving Celia rooted in the doorway, her heart caught in a fear she could not name. Not fear for the belongings, but for the man who had just disappeared into the white. The trail led Boone back into memory. The mule's hooves cracked the frozen crust, falling into the same deep ruts left by a wheel long splintered. Panic was still carved into the snow, where Celia and her children had once been abandoned. Against the endless white, those marks lay raw, like an old wound that never healed. When the trees thinned, the wagon appeared leaning to one side, its wheel shattered timbers split and gray with time. Silent, forsaken, like a grave without a name. Boone drew a long breath. His face showed nothing, but in his chest, echoes stirred. He remembered the nights he too had been left behind, at saloons, on train platforms, in rented rooms, where morning came with nothing but smoke and laughter fading away. He swung down from the saddle. The woods were so still, he heard the crack of timber beneath his boots. He began to gather what remained a worn blanket, a small wooden chest, rain-dampened books, a pair of shoes no larger than his palm. Little things, scraps to most. Yet to a family, they were everything. One by one, he tied them to the mule's back. His hands moved slow, heavy. With every knot pulled tight, Celia's voice echoed again in his ears. They left us. By the time Boon returned, the sun had sunk low behind the ridge. The cabin glowed faint gold in the fading light. And Celia was there still, at the door shawl, clutched at her throat, eyes scanning the trail. All day, her heart had hung suspended, fearing what she had always known, that men leave and never return. Then came the hoofbeats, steady, heavy. She raised a hand to her mouth as tears welled. Boon emerged from the snow, broad shoulders dark against the white. Behind him, the mule staggered under its load, blankets, books, a small chest, a pair of shoes. Boon stopped at the porch, dropped the reins, his voice rough. Only these. Celia stepped forward, her hand trembling as she touched the chest. Her fingers traced its weathered grain as though she were touching memory itself. She lifted her eyes, meeting his, and without meaning to, her hand pressed lightly against his arm, just a touch. But it was enough to halt Boon in his tracks. The snow soaked him cold, yet through her hand came a warmth unlike any fire. "You didn't have to," Celia whispered, shaking her head. Boon's eyes were dark, unreadable. He held her gaze a long beat before answering simply, "I know. But I did." For that moment in the bitter wind, nothing moved but their eyes. In Celia, he saw more than a mother left behind. He saw a heart that had never been cherished. In Boon, she saw more than hardness. She saw a wound long left open. Then Lyle burst from the door, clutching the chest. Lisa squealed when she found her shoes laughing bright into the dusk. Their voices scattered the silence. Boon turned away, but in his eyes glimmered something he dared not name. Inside, lamplight flickered. Celia knelt before the chest, untying knots with trembling hands, breath quick, as if afraid it might all vanish like a dream. When the lid creaked open, the musty scent of damp wood rose up. Lyle pulled out a book, its cover peeling, but the words inside still intact. His face lit, holding it close like treasure. Lisa hugged her worn shoes, fingers stroking every frayed stitch. To strangers, they were scraps. To the children, they were proof their past had not been erased. Celia's hand found a piece of cloth unevenly stitched. Tears fell, fast blotting its threads. Boon leaned against the doorframe, watching. He did not move, did not speak. Yet inside him stirred something both familiar and long forgotten, the ache of witnessing a family whole, fragile yet alive. Lisa ran to him, shoes in hand. "Look," she cried. Boon bent slightly, his broad palm brushing her hair. Just a touch, and the child beamed as though the world had been restored. Boon stepped back quickly, uneasy, because he had crossed a line he had never meant to. Celia rose, eyes glistening. I don't know how to thank you." Boon shook his head. His voice was low, gravel soft. "You don't have to." And in that moment, the cabin ceased to be mere shelter. It became a place where broken pieces were pieced back together by the quiet, unseen hands of a cowboy who once believed his life would end in silence. That evening, Celia stirred stew over the fire. The scent of venison, potatoes, onions filled the small room. Lyle sat at the table devouring the book with bright eyes. Lisa cradled a cracked wooden doll, her laughter spilling into the warm air. Boone sat in the corner, a cup of cold coffee in hand, his gaze drifting to Celia as she moved about the room. The firelight brushed her face, weary, yet unyielding. He thought of her hand on his earlier, the faintest touch, but still burning on his skin like live coal. He tightened his grip on the cup, trying to look away. But his eyes betrayed him, returning again and again to her. Celia turned, caught his stare. She paused, then smiled. A small smile, fragile as silk, but enough to soften the air between them. Boone lowered his gaze, clearing his throat, hiding his unease. Dinner passed in silence, broken only by spoons against bowls. Yet for Celia and the children, it was the first meal in days, free of trembling. Lyle ate quick, as if afraid it might vanish. Lisa looked up often, whispering thank you with each bite. Boone found those words harder to bear than any gunfight. Afterward, Celia tidied the table. Her hands trembled faintly. Boone started to rise, but she shook her head. "Let me." Her voice was steady, determined, as if to prove she was more than a burden. Boone sat back, the fire stretching his shadow long across the wall. That night when the children slept, Boone stepped outside the valley, drowned in darkness. Smoke from his cigarette curled into the air, fading into pine-scented wind. His horse whickered softly in the stable chains, rattling a reminder that peace was always fragile. The door creaked. Celia stepped out, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her slender form outlined by firelight spilling from the cabin. She hesitated, then sat beside him on the porch. Moonlight bathed the board silver. For a long while they said nothing. Then Celia whispered, voice thin as frost, "When you brought back the chest, I thought you wouldn't return." Boone exhaled, smoke gaze fixed on the dark. "I've walked away before, too many times, but not this time." "Why?" she asked softly. His answer came low, gravel deep. "Because no one deserves to be left out there. Not like that." Silence stretched. Celia's hands tightened in her lap. "All my life, I've been left behind. So many times I thought I must not be worth anyone coming back for." Boone turned his head. In the moonlight, her face trembled, yet her eyes glowed like embers refusing to die. And then, without plan, without thought, Celia's hand touched his. Lightly, tentative. Boone froze. Her thin fingers carried warmth unlike any fire. It seeped past the stone wall inside him, striking deep. "Celia." His voice caught. She pulled back quickly, eyes darting skyward. "I'm sorry." Boone shook his head, voice rough. "No need." They sat in silence, the night breathing around them. Yet both knew what had shifted. The past, heavy as it was no longer borne by one alone. For the first time in years, Boone felt he did not face memory by himself. When Celia rose and slipped back inside, Boone remained. The moon climbed high silver, pouring across his hand the one she had touched. He curled it into a fist, trembling, then let out a long breath. And there in the cold of the Montana night, a cowboy who once believed he was made only for silence allowed himself to hold the fragile warmth of a touch. Part 5. The Whisper on the Porch. That night the sky was clear at last. After days of blizzard, the heavens opened wide, scattered with stars. The Milky Way stretched pale and silver like a river stitched across the dark. Moonlight spilled over the valley, washing the snow in a gentle glow, as though the forest itself had been sewn back together with threads of light. Boone sat on the porch steps back against the post, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. Smoke from the cabin hearth lingered thin in the air before drifting away. His horse stood quiet in the stall, only shifting a hoof now and then. This was a moment Boone knew well. Deep night solitude, the wilderness holding its breath. And yet tonight was not like any night before. The door creaked behind him. Celia stepped out, wrapped in her wool shawl. She hesitated, then lowered herself beside him. Not close enough to touch, but not as far as she once kept. "The children are asleep," she said softly. Boone nodded, eyes still on the sky. "Good." The wind carried the smell of pine smoke melting snow, and faintly her hair. Boone drew a slow breath, keeping his face unreadable. He knew her presence was changing something inside him, though he had no name for it. Celia rested her hand on the step, her gaze on the valley silvered in moonlight. "It's been a long time since I saw the sky like this. Back in Virginia, I used to sit on the porch while my mother read prayers under the stars. When she died, I stopped. I couldn't bear the heavens too wide when my heart was too empty." Boone turned his face, eyes darkening. Her words struck the hollow he carried. He too had avoided the stars because they reminded him of how small, how alone he was beneath them. He said nothing, but in the silence, Celia felt it that she was not alone under the sky anymore. The cowboy sat there wordless, yet sharing the weight of that vastness with her. The moonlight revealed two wounds side by side, one from abandonment, the other from loneliness. Celia pulled the shawl tighter, shivering in the night air. Boone set his cup down, shrugged off his heavy coat, and draped it across her shoulders. Her eyes widened. "You'll freeze." He only shrugged. His voice came low, rough. "I can take it." Celia gripped the edge of the coat. Warmth spread through her chest, not from the fire, but from the man beside her. In that instant, the distance between them shrank. "Boone," she whispered. After a long pause, "I'm not used to anyone looking after me." A sound came from him, not quite a laugh, not quite a growl. "Best get used to it." Celia lowered her gaze, fingers tightening until her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, not from the cold, but from those blunt words, clumsy, yet carrying a promise of shelter. The wind swept across the porch, tugging her loose hair. A strand brushed Boone's arm. He stiffened, then without thinking, brushed it aside. His fingers grazed her cheek. A jolt ran through him. He pulled back at once, but it was too late. They had both felt it. Celia turned away, her lips trembling faintly. Their shadows lay long across the snow, his and hers overlapping. Boone stared down, chest tight. He had sworn never to let anyone fill the empty space inside him. But tonight, that space already carried her shape. Her voice drifted low, fragile as wind. "Maybe not everyone leaves." Boone did not answer. But in his dark eyes, a spark flickered, weak, stubborn, alive, like an ember, refusing to die. The silence stretched, broken only by the hush of wind and the faint rustle of trees. Celia slowly let go of the coat's edge, lifting her eyes to the stars. They shimmered in her gaze, weary yet unbroken. "There were moments I thought we'd die out there," she said quietly. "On that snow road." I was ready to go holding the children. And then you came. Boone's shoulders stiffened. Her words struck the deepest wound he carried, the guilt of all the times he had walked away before, too afraid of loss to stay. Celia turned, meeting his eyes. You didn't have to take us in, but you did. I don't understand why. Boone's jaw clenched. He wanted to say it was instinct no more than a reflex, like reining a horse at the sound of a shot. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was her tears, the broken cries of her children. Those had turned him back. His voice came rough, almost breaking. Because no one deserves to be left behind. I know what that feels like. Celia stilled. The wind tugged her hair across her cheek. She lowered her head, then slowly nodded. I believe you. The words struck Boone harder than any bullet. I believe you. Trust something he thought forever lost was being handed back to him. The stone wall inside cracked wider. Her gaze held his steady, tender. Boone knew some truths didn't need oaths. Spoken in silence under the stars, they could change a man's whole life. The night softened. The air smelled of pine resin and thawing snow. Celia inched closer, careful, as if afraid he might pull away. But Boone stayed still, every muscle taut, waiting. She leaned gently, letting her head rest against his chest. The motion was natural, as if she had done it all her life. Boone's heartbeat thundered under her ear, strong and uneven, so unlike the man who seemed carved from stone. He froze, hands hovering in the air. Then Celia whispered, soft as breath, "Thank you." The last crack in Boone's heart split wide. Pain flared sharp, but not the pain of loss, the ache of life returning. Without thought, he lowered his arm, wrapping her shoulders, pulling her closer, holding her like something fragile he could not let go. Celia's eyes closed. On her face spread a peace Boone had never seen a woman once abandoned now finding rest at last. And he who had turned from every promise had become the chest she leaned on. The stars watched in silence. The wind fell quiet. Only the fire inside the cabin whispered. In that moment, Boon Lark, a cowboy who had sworn love was a lie, let two words "thank you" walk straight into the wild country of his heart. The moon slipped behind the ridge. Boone stayed where he was, back against the post, Celia asleep in his arms. Her breath rose and fell against him, each one driving a nail deeper into the wall that once kept him alone. He looked down at her face, in starlight hair, loose across his shirt, the same woman who had carried her children through snow, abandoned but unbroken. Now she slept in peace against him. Boone's throat tightened. For years, he had believed his heart was dead land. Tonight he felt it stir. Inside, Lisa whimpered. Lyle shifted, then fell still again. Boone listened, ever the sentinel. But for the first time, he realized he wasn't keeping watch for himself. He was keeping watch over a home. When dawn crept red over the horizon, the snow turned to fire beneath the rising sun. Light spilled across the porch, finding the two of them still together. Boone breathed deep. Cold filled his lungs, but inside his chest burned warm. Celia stirred, blinking away sleep. She lifted her head, saw herself, still resting against him. For a moment she faltered, but Boone did not let go. His arm tightened just slightly, not to bind, but to assure safe. She looked toward the brightening sky, a tear slipping free, not of fear, but of peace. Last night, it wasn't a dream. Boone bent, close voice, gravel deep. No, it was real. And in that silence, a beginning was written. On a small porch in the Montana wilds, two shadows joined two lives, once defined by loss, now shaped into something new. A home. Boon raised his eyes to the sunrise. For the first time, he did not seek escape. He made no promises, offered no words for tomorrow. But he knew this much from the moment Celia whispered, "Thank you," against his chest. This porch was no longer the refuge of a lone drifter. It had become the doorway of a family. Part 6. The Lesson of the Revolver. Morning lay thick with fog. A pale curtain draped across the valley. The grass was wet with dew, each step leaving faint prints on the damp earth. In the stall, Boone's horse gave a low whinny, while inside the cabin, the children still slept, curled warm beneath blankets after a long night's rest. Boone stood on the porch, arms folded, eyes fixed on the thinning line of trees. In his hand rested the old Colt, its barrel, worn steel, catching the weak morning light. The cabin door creaked. Celia stepped out, her shawl pulled close, eyes heavy with sleep, but steadier now than when Boone had first found her. "Come with me," Boone said, voice low, rough but certain. Celia blinked, surprised. She did not question him, only followed her steps quick across the wet grass. They stopped in a clearing where a few old pines stood like quiet sentries. Boone lifted his chin toward a thick trunk bark, rough and pale. "That'll do for a target." Her brows knit. "I've never touched a gun before." Boone nodded once, placing the Colt in her hand. "Then today, you touch one." The revolver was heavier than she expected. Cold metal pressed into her palm, and her chest tightened. Memories rushed her husband walking away the crack of a wagon, breaking the helplessness of not being able to shield her children. Boone stood close, steady. His voice came deep and measured. "Don't lock your arms. Keep them soft. Breathe out. Then squeeze the trigger." Celia raised the Colt hands, trembling. Her breath stuttered. Boone stepped nearer, his rough hand covering hers, guiding the barrel. "Look straight. Don't look at fear." The shot rang out, tearing through the fog. The bullet struck dirt wide of the mark, kicking up dust. Celia gasped, nearly dropping the revolver. Her pulse thundered, fingers numb. Boone caught the gun, calm as stone. No matter. Everyone misses the first time. She swallowed, sweat beading despite the chill. Yet in her eyes, beneath fear, a spark flickered, the glimmer of someone who had stepped across a threshold, however shaky. Boone pulled cartridges from his leather pouch, offering them. Again. Her breath hitched, but she nodded. The second shot skimmed bark, leaving only a pale scrape. Birds burst from the branches' wings, flapping wild. Celia flinched, but her gaze stayed forward. Boone gave a small nod. Better. The third shot landed far wide. She sagged, nearly defeated. Boone's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting slow and firm. "Celia, it isn't the gun that shakes. It's you. Hold it steady. Stand tall." Her lips pressed thin. She lifted her head. Boone's gaze held hers, not cold, not cruel, but filled with a trust that startled her. As if in handing her this weapon, he had handed her part of himself. She raised the Colt again. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. The fourth bullet struck true, biting the trunk near center. The sound jolted her eyes, flying wide. A smile broke across her lips, small, trembling, but real. Boone's mouth twitched, almost a smile, though he reined it back. "There. See, you don't need someone else to shield you. You can shield yourself." Celia lowered the revolver, her chest heaving. She had not believed it possible. Tears pricked, but they were not of fear. They were release. Why are you teaching me this?" she whispered. Boon's eyes met hers, shadowed yet lit by morning haze. "Because no one should spend a life depending on a man who might walk away." Her grip tightened on the gun. His words struck the oldest wound inside her, but instead of pain, they gave her ground beneath her feet. She stood straighter, shoulders set, as if reclaiming something she had lost. The fog began to lift sunlight threading through pine boughs. Boon crossed his arms, standing back watching. He did not step in, did not shield her. He only let her face the weight in her hands. Celia steadied her aim, echoing his words. "Loosen the shoulders. Breathe in, breathe out. Don't think about hitting, think about standing." She squeezed. The shot rang. The bullet landed close to the heart of the trunk. Boon gave a slow nod. Again. No protest came this time. She reloaded, fired, missed then corrected, fired again closer. Each shot steadied her more. Each recoil shook less from fear, more from resolve. By the time her hand was raw and aching, her eyes burned with something new. No longer despair. Fire. Boon stepped forward, offering his canteen. She drank, then met his gaze. For once, his storm-gray eyes carried not judgment, but quiet belief. "You don't mind all the misses?" she asked, voice worn but firm. Boon's answer was plain. "I've missed more times than you ever will. What matters is standing back up." The truth sank deep. Boon was not teaching her to kill. He was teaching her to live, to defend, to never again beg someone to stay. He bent, picked a spent casing from the grass, and set it in her palm. "Keep it. To remember, today's the day you stopped running." She clutched it tight, tears brimming, but her spine held straight. For the first time, her fear no longer held the reins. The sun rose higher, clearing the fog. Empty shells glinted in the grass around the scarred tree. Celia stood breath-ragged hair damp with sweat. Yet her eyes shone not weary, but fierce with newfound strength. Boon took the revolver gently from her hand, his rough fingers brushing hers. Steel lay cold between them, but where their skin met, warmth surged hotter than any bullet fired. Celia did not pull away. She looked at him, eyes shimmering. Her voice was hushed, almost lost in the breeze. "Thank you for believing I could." Boon tightened his hold on the gun, but his gaze never wavered. Words caught in his throat. He had lived a life of silence, speaking through action alone. Now silence was enough. He gave a slow nod, heavy as a promise he had never given before. The horse whinnied from the stall, breaking the moment. Boon slid the Colt back into its holster, turning aside. But his chest pounded hard, each beat like a hammer on an anvil. Celia stood frozen, hands still warm from his touch. She lifted her face to the clearing sky, lungs full with something new. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like the abandoned woman left in the snow. She felt like someone who could stand, and someone who was no longer standing alone. Boon took a few steps, then stopped. He did not look back, but his voice carried low across the clearing. "From now on, if anyone comes for you, and the children, you know what to do." Celia pressed her lips together, tears shining, but her smile was steady. In her eyes, Boon saw more than gratitude. He saw trust. The sun slanted down, casting their shadows long across the ground, littered with spent shells. A cowboy once sworn to solitude. A woman once resigned to being left behind. And in that clearing, through the sharp echo of gunfire, something had taken root. Not fear, but strength. Boon knew then Celia was no burden carried from the snow. She was his companion. Part 7. The House Rebuilt. Winter gave way slowly, leaving behind a cabin roof streaked with leaks, water stains darkening the old beams. Boon stood high on the rafters, hammer in hand, his broad shoulders outlined against the pale spring sun. Each strike rang through the valley, blending with the caw of crows and the whisper of wind through the pines. Down in the yard, Celia lifted boards, one by one, a faded straw hat shading her face. Her dress was mud-stained sleeves, rolled cheeks flushed with sweat, yet her eyes burned bright with resolve. The children darted around her, laughing, gathering stray nails, carrying them proudly to their mother. Boon bent to take the next board from Celia. Their fingers brushed. A fleeting, ordinary touch, yet it made him pause. He hit it with a grunt, hammering again, though the edge of his mouth twitched close to a smile. No need to be so precise. Celia teased gently, as long as the rain stays out. Boon tilted his head, voice dry but tinged with humor. Not here. I don't do things halfway. Celia laughed, a light sound slipping into the sunlight. It startled Boon so much he nearly dropped his hammer. The cabin had known only wind hoof beats and creaking wood for years. Now there was laughter, and his heart beat differently because of it. When he finally climbed down, sweat running down his temple, Celia held out a cloth. Boon took it, wiping his brow, his gaze lingering on her hair, tousled face glowing pink with sun. A strange sweetness rose in him, unfamiliar yet welcome. He turned away, stacking boards to hide it. But for the first time in years, his lips curved, not in bitterness, but in something real. By afternoon, Boon carried a hoe to the clearing behind the cabin. The ground was still hard, but softening with the thaw. He drove the blade deep, each strike releasing the raw, damp scent of earth. Celia followed, cradling a basket of seed he had found in the loft, beans, onions, corn. Kneeling, she pressed her hands into the soil dirt, smearing her palms. Yet she worked on, undeterred. Boon glanced at her slight figure, stubborn in the field, and thought of a young shoot forcing its way through stone. "Don't bury them too deep," Boon said quietly. "Seeds need to breathe." Celia squinted up at him through sunlight. "So you know farming. 2 enough to last 8 winters," he answered. She smiled. "Then I want to learn, so I can last them with you." Boon froze. The word "with" sank into him like a seed buried in his chest. He worked harder after that silent each swing of the hoe, heavier than the last, as though to cover the stirring inside. Lyle rushed to try the hoe, Boon guiding his grip. Lisa crouched beside her mother, pressing tiny seeds into the soil while humming a tune. It was an ordinary scene, but to Boon, it was something he had never dared imagine, a family working side by side beneath a setting sun. When the last row was sown, Boon leaned on the hoe, sweat dripping down his neck. Celia stood brushing dirt from her dress. Her eyes lingered on the fresh rows with more than satisfaction, they glimmered with hope. Boon caught the look, and despite himself, smiled back. The next morning, Boon hauled long beams he had once saved for mending the stable. With shovel and sweat, he set posts firm in the ground. Celia held each plank upright, her hands steady despite the strain. The sun burned higher. Sweat streaked Boon's brow, yet what stopped him cold was seeing Celia too thin. arms braced around heavy timber, sweat soaking her temples, no word of complaint. "You don't need to work this hard," Boon muttered, his voice gruff. Celia shook her head, hair damp against her cheeks. "I want this fence built, for the children, so they know this is home." The word struck Boon deep, harder than any hammer blow. Home. He clenched the shovel and dug harder, as if to hide what stirred. Lyle stumbled up with a fistful of nails, Lisa clutching a coil of wire tight to her chest. Boon frowned softly. "Easy there. Watch your hands." His tone was stern, but his eyes warmed, betraying something he couldn't hold back anymore. When the first stretch of fence stood tall, Celia stepped back, eyes shining. "Look," she breathed. "It's like we're building a whole new life." Boon followed her gaze. And for once, he didn't see the fence as a barrier. He saw it as shelter. That evening, they sat on a rough log, hands raw, shoulders aching. Celia's palms were cut from wire, Boon wrapping them gently with old cloth. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "Have you done all this alone before?" she asked quietly. Boon nodded. "Built roofs, fences, even dug a grave for the old mare. Alone." Her eyes darkened with sorrow. Alone, must have been cold. He said nothing, only looked at the cabin's patched roof half renewed. Silence told her enough. He had borne loneliness longer than words could carry. A breeze swept the valley, smelling of fresh earth. Celia lifted her face to the roof. "It's like the cabin's breathing again." Boon followed her gaze. In the glow of sunset, her face lit warm, weary, yet radiant. Without meaning to, he smiled. Celia caught it. Her heart squeezed. She knew that smile wasn't just for the mended roof. It was an unspoken confession. He was no longer building, only for himself. She lowered her hand, fingertips, brushing Boon's calloused knuckles where they rested on the log. He startled faintly, but did not move away. They sat like that, hand to hand, not clasping, only letting warmth pass quietly between them. As twilight deepened to violet, Boon turned toward her, giving the smallest nod. A silent vow. "We've done this. Together." And in that moment, the porch of his lonely cabin ceased to be the seat of a watchman waiting for night to pass. It had become the porch of a home where two people were not just mending wood, but building something greater. Part 8. Sharing the pain. Evening settled over the valley, the sky burning crimson like spilled embers across the horizon. The last rays touched the cabin's new roof, casting Boon's face in bronze and shadow. He sat on the porch steps, a small knife in hand, whittling at a nameless piece of wood. Celia came out, brushing flour from her dress. The scent of cornbread still lingered in the air, mixing with the resin of fresh-cut pine. She sat beside him, close enough to hear her own heartbeat, yet leaving a space between them. In the yard, the children laughed, riding scraps of wood like horses. Their joy carried through the dusk, but Celia's gaze drifted far. Her hands rested on her knees, her voice quiet, almost breaking. "You know," she whispered, "I once believed a man would bring me to a home, that he'd keep his word, send for me when things were ready." Boon's knife stopped. His eyes hardened. Celia swallowed, her voice trembling. But no letter ever came. "I spent what little I had hired a wagon. They promised to carry me and the children the rest of the way. But halfway through the mountains, they left us. Said there wasn't room." said they didn't have patience. The truth was, I had nothing more to pay. She turned away, hiding a tear. I stood there in the snow, with my children waiting for a man who would never return. That's when I knew. We'd been abandoned. Boone set the knife down, fist closing so tight around the wood it cracked. His eyes darkened, and in them stirred an old wound he knew too well. Not by thought, but by memory. Celia wiped at her cheeks, forcing a fragile smile. I shouldn't burden you with this. You've already done more than enough. Boone shook his head, voice rough. No need to apologize. Silence stretched. Then Boone drew a breath heavy as stone breaking. I waited once, too, for someone who never came back. Celia turned, startled. Boone's elbows rested on his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkening trail. My brother. We grew up on these Montana fields. He always a headstrong, quick, me trailing behind. One day, he took a freight run on the Bozeman line. They said it was an accident. Dead before I could get there. I was towns away. Boone's voice dropped like earth caving in. When I arrived, all I found was his hat lying by the rails. Folks said it was quick. He didn't feel it. But they didn't know. The hurt left behind hasn't ended yet. Celia's hand rested lightly on her knee near Boone's, her eyes shining with understanding. She didn't say, I'm sorry. Some wounds were too deep for those words. Boone's voice rasped low. From that day, I lived like the one left behind. Every night I wondered if I'd been there, maybe I could have stopped it. Celia's eyes glistened yet steady. You can't carry the blame, but I know what that emptiness feels like. I carry it too, since the day he left us, since the wagons turned away. Two shadows stretched long beneath the blood-red sky. No promises, no comfort. Just silence, and the truth that their pain was no longer borne alone. And in that silence, Boone and Celia discovered the rarest thing the frontier could offer someone who stayed. Night fell, bringing cold mixed with pine and damp earth. Inside, firelight painted their shadows against the walls. The children slept soundly, their breathing even beneath the blankets. Boone sat at the table, his knife working slowly against the wood carving lines like scars across his own weathered face. Celia sat across hands' clenched eyes fixed on the fire. Sometimes she whispered, what I fear most isn't hunger or cold. It's the day my children grow up and ask me, where is their father? And I won't know how to answer. Boone looked up. Firelight burned in her tired eyes. Celia's lips trembled. I told myself, if I just waited, if I loved enough, he'd come back. But he didn't. And each day I wondered, maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe that's why he left. Boone set the wood aside. His hands closed hard. He knew that feeling, turning blame inward when loss wasn't yours to bear. He looked at her eyes heavy, and instead of denial, he gave her a slow nod. A recognition. The fire popped and cracked, whispering with the ghosts of their past. They sat not as rescuer and rescued, but as two bare souls, their grief laid open between them. Wind pressed against the shutters, rattling the cabin. Celia pulled the quilt, close shoulders trembling. Boone moved at last steady and sure. His calloused hand reached for hers. She flinched lightly, then stilled. The warmth of his palm seeped into her skin, strange yet familiar. Slowly, she lifted her gaze. Boone's eyes, dark and shadowed, didn't look away. Not to comfort, he said softly, his voice deep as wind over the plains. Just to carry it with you. Tears spilled down Celia's cheeks, glimmering in the firelight. She said nothing. She only let her hand remain in his. And for the first time, she did not feel alone in her sorrow. Boon sat unmoving, feeling her tears on his skin. He was no man for tenderness, but he didn't let go. Because for that moment, he too was no longer the one left behind. The silence between them changed. No longer cold, but the kind of silence where pain is shared without words. On the wall, firelight joined their shadows, one scarred cowboy, one abandoned woman. But in the meeting of their hands, the two figures merged into something steadier, as if their grief had finally found a place to rest. At dawn, thin sunlight slipped through the cabin's cracks. Boon startled awake, still in his chair. His hand still rested over Celia's. Neither had pulled away through the night. Celia stirred, blinking against the light. When she saw their hands still joined, a long breath escaped her, not sharp with fear, but soft, released like freedom. The children shifted on the bed. Lyle stretched. Lisa mumbled a song in her sleep. Boon looked from them to Celia, and for once his eyes held no distance, only a quiet gentleness. Celia sat up, slowly pulling her hand back, though Boon left his on the quilt, open unhidden. She glanced up, caught his gaze, and in it read what he did not speak. I understand, and I'm still here. Morning light spilled over the patched roof, the new fence, the rough-hewn home remade. Everything gleamed with a softer hue. Celia's eyes welled as she whispered, for the first time, "This feels like home." Boon said nothing. He only drew a breath, filling his chest, not with ash from the past, but with the clean scent of new wood, fresh earth, and something unspoken, something beginning. And there, beneath the rising sun, they sat together, not promising, not clinging, only knowing that from this moment on, their pain no longer walked alone. In the harshest country, they had found the rarest treasure, someone who stayed when the night was over. Part 9. A simple proposal. The snow melted slowly on the hillsides, uncovering tender shoots of green. Behind the cabin, the creek brimmed with spring water, tumbling over stones in a quiet song. Across the field, blades of grass pushed through damp soil, reaching for the sun. After a winter of trial, life returned as if by miracle. Boon stood at the edge of the clearing, hoe resting on his shoulder boots, sunk deep into soft mud. He was used to this sight every spring, breaking ground alone. But this year, he wasn't alone. Celia stepped from the cabin, a basket of seed in hand. Her dress was streaked with mud, her hair tied back with a thin rope. Her eyes lit as she looked over the field, seeing in it something more than seeds. She saw hope. The children trailed behind Lyle, leaping onto the ridge, pretending to swing a hoe like Boon. Little Lisa cradled seeds in her palm, as if they were treasure, offering them carefully into her mother's hand. Boon carved neat furrows in the earth. Celia followed close, dropping each seed with care, her face glowing. Boon looked up once and met her gaze. In the scent of fresh earth and the rush of water nearby, they knew this was more than planting. It was the start of a new life. When Celia brushed soil gently over the seeds, she lifted her head and smiled a smile warm as spring sun. Boon froze for a breath. Once she had trembled in the snow, abandoned with her children. Now she stood here, steady, planting faith back into the earth. And in Boon's chest, a thought thundered like hoofbeats. It's time. By evening, Wind carried the smell of damp earth and budding pine. Boon lingered at the field's edge, staring at the horizon as though it might answer. Celia joined him, brushing wind-blown hair from her face, hands still stained with soil. "Tomorrow it will rain," she murmured, watching clouds gather to the west. Boon nodded. "Rain's good for seed." Celia smiled faintly. "You always think of surviving first. I think of blooming." Boon turned toward her. That smile caught him hard. Never had he imagined a woman standing beside him speaking of flowers as if they were certain. He drew a deep breath, hand trembling slightly as he set the hoe down. Then, like a cowboy facing down his fiercest enemy, Boon stepped closer. His voice came rough short, but true. "I want you to be my wife." Celia stilled. Wind tugged her dress hair spilling loose. Her eyes widened, lips trembling. Boon stood tall, his gaze dark but unwavering. "Not because you need shelter, not because the children need a roof, but because I want you here. Not just this winter, not just this planting, for all the rest." Tears brimmed, spilling before she could stop them. She had heard promises before empty words, followed by abandonment. But Boon's blunt, unpolished words carried more weight than all the vows she had ever been given. Celia nodded, her voice breaking but firm. "All right, I will." The wind swept across the thawing field, and for Boon, it wasn't just spring that had returned. His heart, too, was breaking open into bloom. But Celia's tears had not yet dried. She lifted her chin, voice trembling, but steady. "If we do this, Boon, I need one thing." His brow furrowed, waiting. Celia's hands gripped the edge of her dress. "I don't want a marriage just to survive. I've had enough empty promises. If all you want is someone to cook and mend, I can do that, but I won't call it marriage." Boon said nothing. Sunset burned in his eyes, red as iron in the forge. Celia pressed on, voice cracking. "I need to know that this time I won't be left. I can't face another road with 2 children in my hands, waiting for someone who never comes back." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh earth. Boon looked at her long and hard. Slowly, he reached for her hand, rough palm closing over hers, firm, steady, unyielding. "Celia," his voice rasped like fire in old wood, "I don't know how to make promises. I only know how to keep them. If you need a vow, here's mine. I stay." Her vision blurred with tears, and for the first time she believed. Not because the words were smooth, but because they were plain, carved from truth. They stood there in the fading light, her tears drying in the wind, his grip unbroken. Then Celia drew a shaky breath, forcing a small laugh through her tears. "If we marry, I won't sleep on that squeaking bed of yours. And that wobbly table, Boon, it has to go." Boon blinked. Then a rough, low laugh rumbled from his chest, startling even to him. He hadn't heard his own laughter in years. Celia's eyes shone as she smiled back. "Then we'll fix it all. The table, the bed, even the roof." Boon shook his head, still smiling faintly. "If you're here, I'll fix everything." The cabin seemed warmer for it. The brook's murmur, the whispering grass, all joined the quiet joy kindling between them. That night in the firelit cabin, Celia set hot stew and cornbread on the shaky table. Boon sat across the wood, creaking beneath his arm. Celia smirked, tapping the table. "Told you it won't last us long." Boon grunted, half admission, half laugh, breaking bread with slow, deliberate care. Across from him, Celia's gentle smile lit the room brighter than the fire. The children ate heartily, Lyle sitting stiff-backed, like a man Lisa humming between bites. Boone looked at them, then at Celia. Something inside him loosened not into pain, but into peace. Celia tapped the table again softly. Boone, when you asked me to be your wife, I knew it wasn't fancy words. That's why I believed you. Boone met her gaze, and in that moment, he understood the greatest work of his life was not saving a life, not building a home, but opening the door of his own heart. The table groaned, spilling a drop of stew onto the scarred wood. Boone stilled, then chuckled low. Celia laughed too, their voices mingling with the crackle of fire. And in that simple cabin with a broken table and a plain meal, Boon Lark knew 3 short words. Be my wife had changed everything. No rings, no ceremony, just a bowl of stew, 2 children safe, and the woman across from him smiling. And it was enough. Part 10. The wedding beneath the Cottonwood spring slipped into early summer. The meadow around the cabin was white with wild daisies. Celia woke before dawn, sitting by the window, weaving a narrow blue ribbon into her hair. No veil, no fine silk, only a scrap of cloth. Yet in her eyes shone something brighter than Jewel's peace, long denied, but finally found. Lyle rummaged through Boone's old chest and lifted out a worn Bible. His small fingers smoothed the frayed cover, his young face alight with pride. Today, he would be the witness. Beside him, Lisa giggled as she wove tiny flowers into a crown, placing it crookedly on her head. In his room, Boone buttoned a clean shirt washed and pressed by Celia's hands the night before. He stood before a cracked mirror, his rough fingers clumsy at the collar. This man, who had faced storms and gunfights without flinching, felt his hands tremble at something as small as a button. Through the window, he glimpsed the old cottonwood tree at the far end of the field, standing tall as it had for generations. Once, it was only a silent shadow in his life. Today, it would bear witness to something new. Celia stepped outside her plain dress, stirring in the breeze. When Boone's eyes met hers, he dipped his head, awkward, reverent, as though bowing to something greater than himself. Under the cottonwood, its leaves whispering like an ancient hymn, Boone and Celia stood face to face. Sunlight spilled golden through the branches, laying a path at their feet. Lyle clutched the Bible, his voice steady, though still childlike. Love is patient. Love is kind. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Boone gripped his hat in both hands, every word striking deep into the scarred places of his chest. A man who had once mocked love now stood silent, letting a boy's voice teach him what he thought he had buried forever. Celia held out her hand trembling. Boone hesitated only a breath, then laid his rough palm over hers. A simple touch, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. His voice rasped low, but unshakable. No fancy words. Just one thing I'll say, I will stay. Tears spilled down Celia's cheeks, but her smile broke through them like sunlight after rain. She answered firm as a vow written in stone, and I will stand with you. The leaves above rustled louder like applause. Lisa squealed and danced in circles with her flowers. Lyle closed the Bible with solemn pride. And in that moment, Boon Lark, a cowboy who once swore love was a lie, found his family beneath the shade of an old tree. They walked back to the cabin at dusk. No carriage, no music, only the clip of hooves and the laughter of children skipping through tall grass. Inside, Celia stirred stew on the fire, while Boone placed a jug of apple cider on the table. His hands scarred and work-worn, gently set cornbread before the children. Lyle lifted his tin cup of water, with all the gravity of a man twice his years. To family, he declared. Lisa chimed in her laughter, as bright as the wild daisies that crowned her head. Boone sat still watching them, Celia's soft smile through tears, Lyle's pride, Lisa's joy. Something swelled in his chest, not pain, but peace. For the first time in his life, he belonged at a table. Celia met his gaze across the rough boards. Neither spoke, but both knew this was their wedding feast. Not with crowds or silver chalices, but with hot stew, children's laughter, and love that needed no witness but their own hearts. Later, Boone carried Lisa to bed, her head resting trustfully on his shoulder. He laid her down, gently pulled the blanket close. Celia whispered, "You carry her, as if you've done it all your life." Boone froze, voice rough. "I never have." Celia touched his arm. "Then start today." Her words lit something in him, something fragile, something new. He looked from the sleeping child to the woman beside him and understood he was no longer a man alone. At dawn, Boone stepped onto the porch. The air was sweet, with wet earth and wood smoke. Across the field, Celia bent over young onion shoots. Lyle carried a bucket. With solemn care, Lisa played under the cottonwood with the wooden doll Boone had carved for her the night before. Children's laughter rang with the water's rush, and Boone pressed his hat to his chest. His lips moved, whispering for himself alone, "This is home." Celia looked up, catching his eyes. She didn't hear his words, but his smile told her everything. A rare smile, soft as sunrise, warming the face once hardened by loss. Lyle shouted, "We're ready for the day." Lisa waved. Boone stepped down from the porch, took Celia's hand, and together they walked forward. Under the cottonwood's branches, Boon Lark knew he was no longer the lone rider on dusty roads, no longer the man guarding a heart of ashes. He had found his family not through vows shouted to the sky, but through a quiet touch, a whispered thank you, and the courage to stay. And so, in a cabin of rough wood and steady laughter, the cowboy, who never believed in love, finally believed. No one is too broken to be loved. Love begins not with grand promises, but with small acts. A warm meal on a cold night, a roof repaired, together a hand that chooses not to let go. Do you believe a single thank you can change a whole life? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you were in his boots, would you stay to protect the town or ride off into the wild